In 2001, he wrote his first book, which was an international bestseller, translated into 40 languages. His World War II elite forces books, Churchill's Secret Warriors, Hunting the Nazi Bomb, The Nazi Hunters, and the SAS Ghost Patrol are all Sunday Times bestsellers, and I'm sure many of you have them here with you today to get signed after. And several are still being developed into films. He is a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, and a patron of several military charities. He speaks regularly at key national venues about the stories he's told in books, and we're delighted to have him here. There will be a book sale and signing. There will be time for a Q&A. Please give him a very, very warm welcome.
Well, thank you. How does one follow that kind of introduction? It's rather difficult. But two bits of housekeeping first. If anyone was expecting a red-headed actor from Homeland, he is here. He's waiting through that door there. Is my mic on?
I don't know. Can you? No.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
No. Okay. So this is the first bit of housekeeping. Get the mic working. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So, as I was saying, if anyone was expecting a red-headed actor who played in Homeland instead of me, he is here, he's through that door, and if I forget my lines, he's going to come in and kind of take over, so you might see him enter at any moment. The other bit of housekeeping, which is actually very serious, is that I've split my jacket. And my daughter, who's actually filming this for me today, pointed it out to me as I walked in, so it must be because I've been asked to do some Special Forces training myself to try and put some reality into the books, and I must be bulking out a bit, and that's how I split my jacket. So I crave your indulgences. Those two things having been dealt with, I need to take you all back to the autumn of 1944 and northern Italy and the Italian campaign. Basically, this is where the book opens, SAS Italian job. And you will all be aware of the fact that Churchill had urged Allied forces to attack the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy, so that we opened the war on three fronts. We were fighting on the Eastern Front, obviously with the Red Army. There would be the D-Day landings for the Western Front, and Italy was supposed to be the soft underbelly of Europe, where we would thrust through our forces into fatherland, experiencing very little resistance. That was the plan, and Churchill had indeed been told that the war in Italy would be over by Christmas '44. Now, of course, it didn't turn out that way. Italy was far from being the soft underbelly that Churchill had hoped it would be. In fact, by the autumn of '44, in what was one of the worst winters in living memory in Italy, tens of thousands of Allied lives had been lost fighting up through the Italian peninsula, and in particular, thousands had come to grief on what was called the Gothic Line. And the Gothic Line was as it sounds, it was a line of defences built along the Apennine Mountains in northern Italy, consisting of bunkers, minefields, machine gun nests, heavy guns. And indeed, Hitler had sent to Italy some of his best divisions, some of his best Alpine troops, some of his best Panzer divisions. These were not the reserve troops that we'd hoped might be garrisoning Italy. Hitler had vowed that Italy would not fall. It was important for the Reich that Italy did not fall. In a sense, it was one of their last bastions of allies to the Axis cause. And Hitler had also sent to Italy, remember, Field Marshal Kesselring, one of his most accomplished commanders, a commander who was a Hitler favourite, and also a commander who actually was highly respected by the Allied commanders on the opposing side. And so by autumn '44, hundreds of thousands of British and American and Commonwealth troops are massed on the southern side of the Gothic Line, facing these supposedly impregnable defences, and there is a stalemate. And something extraordinary is required to break that stalemate, to enable a breakthrough the Gothic Line, and for Italy to be taken and for Allied forces to march on into Germany itself. And what Allied commanders are racking their brains as to what that thing might be. Now, the Italian resistance had actually played a key role in the Italian campaign. The Germans had lost 20,000 troops to Italian resistance operations by the autumn of '44. And so enraged was Kesselring and Hitler at these Italian partisan operations, which Kesselring called a perverse form of warfare, because these people weren't fighting in uniform. These were behind-the-lines operations. That Hitler had actually ordered for every German soldier killed, 10 Italian reprisals would be taken, 10 Italians would be killed. And this was men, women and children. So whole villages in Italy literally had been wiped out in German reprisals. Savagery on a really terrible scale. And so the plan that was developed to help break the impasse over the Gothic line was to try to arm the Italian resistance to the north of the Gothic line, behind the Gothic line, so they could rise up in the rear, hit the supply lines, and make it impossible for those troops, the hundreds of thousands of German troops garrisoning the Gothic line, to hold come the spring offensive of 45. That was the plan put in place. But to do that, to actually organise the Italian resistance, you needed very, very special, a handful of very, very special Allied troops on the ground to do so, or rather not troops, but special agents. And so, over the winter of 44, what they called euphemistically the BLOs, the British Liaison Officers, were parachuted behind the Gothic line to link up with the partisans. Now, who were the BLOs? Well, the BLOs were the agents of the Special Operations Executive, and as you all know, Special Operations Executive was formed by Churchill in 1940 to set Europe ablaze, to do the things which you're not allowed to do in warfare, to carry out deniable operations with agents deployed in the field who, if they were caught, would be denied by the British government and would face execution as spies. That's what the SOE's remit was. So agents of the SOE were being parachuted behind the Gothic line to link up with the resistance and start these operations behind the lines to try to foment a breakthrough of the Gothic line. And one of the key individuals was a chap called Michael Leese, Captain Michael Leese. Now, Leese had already earned a legendary reputation in SOE. He'd blagged his way into the SOE because they called it the Tweed Cap Boys or the Baker Street Irregulars. And because it was a secret organisation, you couldn't exactly put an advert in the paper saying we're recruiting for a secret organisation, because then it's hardly very secret anymore. So the only way you could actually recruit for the SOE was by those you knew. It was the Old Boys Network. And Mike Leese was not part of the Old Boys Network, so he'd blagged his way in, and the story is told in the book, in the most extraordinary way, in Cairo, talked his way into the SOE office and talked his way into the organisation, and had been deployed to Yugoslavia to link up with the Chetniks and the resistance in Yugoslavia in 1943. He'd carried out lots of guerrilla operations in Yugoslavia with the Chetniks, blowing up lots of German targets. And then he had received an order towards the end of his time there saying, you are to cease offensive operations with the Chetniks. And Mike Leese, being Mike Leese, had taken his order absolutely literally. And so he'd stopped offensive operations with the Chetniks and gone off and carried out any number of solo sabotage missions on his own. Mike Leese had set out with a rucksack full of explosive through the Yugoslav mountains, trekked to the nearest train track and blown up any number of German trains on his own. And when he was eventually extracted from Yugoslavia, he had earned the nickname, rightly, Mike Wildman Leese. And so highly held was he in the higher echelons of the SOE and the British intelligence establishment that MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, wrote to SOE and said, we want Mike Leese for the Secret Intelligence Service. And the SOE said, no, you're not having him, because we're not going to let you have him until the end of the war, he's too valuable. He was a very, very sought-after individual. And he epitomised the kind of people the SOE sought. The SOE sought mavericks, free thinkers, self-starters, people able to operate behind the lines on their own, unsupported. And most importantly of all, actually, what Mike Leese had, he's actually from a very, very, very well-connected Dorset family, long military tradition, lots of baronets in the family. But what Mike Leese had was he had the common touch. He had the ability to talk to Chetniks or Italian resistance fighters, farmers and peasants from the fields, and give them the inspiration and self-belief to rise up against the enemy, and that's an extraordinary thing. So, autumn 44, Mike Leese is withdrawn from Yugoslavia and sent to northern Italy, sent to Florence, the headquarters of the SOE. And he's inserted by parachute behind the lines to an area right in the centre of the Apennines, right in the centre of the Gothic line, literally just a few kilometres behind the German defences, into the Secchio Valley. And his mission is to link up with the partisans who hold that territory, or so he is told. He parachutes in on the 4th of January 45. And as he's trekking from the drop zone to the local village, he sees a chap walking along the track towards him, who's clearly so British it's unbelievable he can be anything else other than the BLO he's coming in to replace. And lo and behold, the chap says, "Oh, hello, I didn't know you were coming, I thought it was just a load of supplies." And it turns out to be Major Wilcoxon, the BLO, British Liaison Officer, SOE agent that Mike Leese is taking over from. And Wilkinson's story is extraordinary. He's there allegedly with several hundred Italian partisans under his command. Their last supply drop of anything, that's boots, food, weapons, ammunition, anything from the Allies, was in September 1944. So for the last 5 months they have been absolutely forgotten. They've run out of ammunition, they've run out of food, they've run out of serviceable weaponry. In fact, these several hundred strong partisans that Mike Leese thinks he's going in to lead are in total disarray. They are not, by any means, shape or forms, an effective fighting force. And in fact, Wilcoxon had sent messages through to Florence saying, "We have been betrayed, you have forgotten us." And that's exactly what Mike Leese finds on the ground. And indeed, he's only on the ground for 2 days. When the weather turns, the snow blows in, and the Germans realise the partisans are now trapped because they can't go into the high ground. Some of the Apennine Mountains are 7,000 feet tall. They can't go into the high ground because they're snowed in. And the Germans send in 10,000 troops on what they call a rastrellamento. And a rastrellamento is a raking through in Italian, to finish off the Secchio partisans. And they flee in total disarray. Mike Leese flees with them. He flees with the so-called leadership of the partisans. It's a miracle. He escapes and they escape with their lives. But Mike Leese typically sees this as a good thing. He thinks sometimes you need a brush fire to burn out the deadwood. And after the Germans have left, he goes to the Colonel Monti, who's the Italian commander, former army, now commanding the Italian resistance, and he says, come on, Colonel, face it. None of your men are up to task. The only way the Secchio partisans will become an effective fighting force is if you let me take over, you let me get the weapons flown that we need and the training provided to your partisans so we can form a proper guerrilla army to do what I've come here for. And Colonel Monti knows that this is the truth, but he says, look, I'll cut a deal with you. I have to be seen to be in command, otherwise I'll lose face. So in theory, Florence will send me orders and I will give them to you. In truth, Florence will send you the orders and you'll just tell me what I have to do. So that's the deal that's cut. And the first thing Mike Leese does is he sends out one of the most capable partisan commanders and says, go and recruit me your 40 best fighters. We're going to form a special forces and we're going to call them the Battaglioni Merginti, and it's an Italian name that he gives them. And I need you to go out and find them, we're going to train them, and we're going to start ambushing and offensive operations as soon as those 40 men are armed and ready. The second thing he does, and absolutely inspired, is he says, find me 20 of the prettiest young Italian women who are in the resistance that you can find. They are going to be my intelligence unit. And what they're going to do is they're going to get on their bicycles and they're going to cycle through the local German garrisons and checkpoints, which are only 2 or 3 kilometres away, and they're going to flirt outrageously with the German guard forces, and they are going to gather intelligence. And so he forms what he calls his messengers, forgotten the Italian word, damn, staffetters, thank you. He forms his staffetters, which is Italian for messengers. And these young ladies, extremely brave, start going out and doing and gathering intelligence for him. He starts getting so much intelligence into his Secchio headquarters that he's up to 2, 3 in the morning trying to assess it all and trying to choose his targets. What's he looking for? What is Mike Leese searching for? He's searching for that one target, that one operation that will make a difference, that will enable the Gothic line to be broken. And that's not just ambushing the odd convoy, which she's got going on already. And this is when the first real stroke of luck comes into the story. He's been on the ground for a few weeks, and a German army truck drives up the valley, and there's a guy in the front seat, blonde hair, typically Teutonic looking, dressed in full German uniform. And he's a deserter from the German army. In fact, he's a deserter from an elite Alpine unit. He comes to Mike Leese, and Mike Leese sits him down and says, "Why have you deserted?" He says, "Because I don't like the fact that we're carrying out all these nasty reprisals against the Italian villages. This is really, this is brutality. It's not what the German military should be about." Mike Leese says, "I don't believe a word of it. What's your real reason for deserting?" And eventually he gets the true story. This man was fighting on the Eastern Front. He had been away from home for 3 years fighting on the Eastern Front. He gets a telegram from his mother saying, "Your wife is pregnant." He's been away for 3 years. He draws the obvious conclusion. He asks his commanding officer for compassionate leave, and his commanding officer, who is an ardent Nazi, says, "You shouldn't be asking for compassionate leave. You should be celebrating that your wife is breeding another child of the Reich to fight in the Nazi cause." That's the reason he's deserted. He's deserted because he hates his fellow Nazis and fellow German officers. And so Mike Leese, having got the true story out of him, and now kind of trusting him to a certain extent, says, "Is there a target that springs to your mind that you think we should attack?" And Hans, the German deserter, says, "Well, I've heard talk of a headquarters. I've heard talk it's near the town of Reggio Emilia. I've heard talk that General Kesselring is a regular visitor because it's from there he has a direct telephone link to Berlin to talk to Hitler. And there are several other top German generals based there. I don't know its exact location. That's as much as I know." So Mike Leese calls in his staffetters, remember the beautiful young ladies? And he says, "Girls, go out and find where this headquarters is for me and come and tell me where it is." 48 hours later, one of the most beautiful of the lot, I'm afraid I can't remember her name, but I remember the description. She's grey-eyed. And Leese says she had the look of all the world in her eyes. She comes back from her intelligence gathering mission, 48 hours. And she says, "I found out chapter and verse about the headquarters." She'd gone to the local battalion. She had seduced the battalion commander. She'd done her duty for Italy, for the Allies, the cause. And she'd come back with the full story. This is the location of the headquarters. General Kesselring is there weekly. General Holk is there weekly. In fact, he's based there permanently. And it's the headquarters of the German 14th Army. Now, what did that mean? The 14th Army commanded 100,000 men. The 100,000 men the 14th Army commanded were the 100,000 troops manning the central portion of the Gothic line, which was exactly where the Allies planned to try to gain their breakthrough. So clearly, if Leese could take out that Allied headquarters, that was the knockout blow that everybody, Leese most of all, was hungering for. So he has to look at what strike force he has to hand. Now, he's got a few hundred Italian partisans. He describes them as a ragtag band of mountain bandits. He's had arms flown in. He's trying to train and instill in them a sense of a fighting force. But you've got to bear in mind, the 14th Army headquarters is based in two villas, the Villa Rossi and the Villa Calvi, two basically castles. It's impregnable. It's got 1,000 German troops surrounding it, with everything up to heavy armour. This is a very, very, very serious target to try and take on. So he's got his Italian partisans. Fortunately, and amazingly, he's also got 100 Russians. Now, how on earth in the Italian mountains you have 100 Russians? It's because there's a load of Russian prisoners been taken prisoner on the Eastern Front, former Red Army fighters. They've been brought to Italy to work as slave labour on the Gothic line, improving the defences of the Gothic line, okay? And as soon as that are possible, they've actually run away, as you would. And they've run away into the mountains and they've joined the resistance. He's got 100 former Red Army fighters who are Slavic solidarity vodka-swilling fighters of the highest order. Those he knows he can rely on. The Italians, he knows it's a lot about theatre. If he can give them enough sense of self-belief, they will fight. He's also got half a dozen former French foreign legionnaires who have somehow managed to end up in the Italian mountains. He's also got 2 or 3 former fighters from the Spanish Civil War who've somehow ended up in the Italian mountains. And most extraordinary of all, he's got Fritz Snapper, who's a former lieutenant of the Dutch army, who when the Germans overran Holland and the Dutch surrendered, thought, I need to go and join the British to fight, and thought the best way to get to Britain is to make my way to Switzerland, jump on a plane and fly to the UK. Somehow got to Switzerland, realised there were no flights going to the UK anymore, and ended up wandering to the mountains and joining the resistance. So what he has is a polyglot force of many nationalities, speaking about half a dozen different languages: German, French, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, that he has to somehow mould into a force to take on the 14th Army headquarters. You could say it's a mission impossible. So what does he do? He thinks, we can do this, but what I need is a sharp tip to my spear. I need a force that can come in and lead the rest of my ragtag army into war. And so he radios Florence headquarters, and he says, look, could you send me at least 20, maybe 40 commandos? Just the tip of the spear with which I can hit this vital target. And this is where the second piece of incredible good fortune comes into play in the story. There is a legendary SAS commander who you've probably all heard of called Major Roy Farren. Okay? Farren was injured in the Battle of Cemetery Hill in Crete in 41. Okay? Shot in both legs, captured by the Germans, escaped from the POW camp on crutches. This is in Italy. Okay? Managed to steal a boat and sail from southern Italy to North Africa and rejoin British forces. Okay? Then the British High Command said, you're too badly injured, you can't fight anymore. So he used his connections to volunteer for the SAS, got into the SAS, and in November 44, he's given a new squadron to command. He's just fought his way all across northern France, by the way, for several weeks, 500 miles behind the lines. And in November 44, he's given a new squadron to command, number 3 Squadron SAS, because the commander of number 3 Squadron SAS, another legendary commander, Mickey Rooney, parachuted into France, broke his back, and they no longer have a commander. So Farren takes over, and that squadron, number 3 Squadron SAS, are redeployed to Italy. So Farren turns up in the Florence headquarters, and about the time Mike Leigh sends his message saying, I need a tip of the spear, right? And it's a curious thing, because I've never really been able to, in all the research I've done, I cannot fathom out the commander of the SOE in Florence, a chap called Mackintosh. Mackintosh thinks, I've got Leigh in the field, who's a wild man and a lunatic. I've got Farren, who just turned up, who's a total wild man and a lunatic. Farren was quite open about the fact he only obeyed the orders he thought were worth obeying. Okay? And he thinks, Leigh is calling for Farren, and I know, but he doesn't want to, he says, this is going to be a night that they will be completely beyond our control. But Farren hears Leig's request, and Farren answers. And he says, I'm here with number 3 Squadron SAS. And Leigh radios him and says, bring as many men as you can. Okay? So Farren goes, and actually the really fascinating thing is, number 3 Squadron SAS are in northern Italy. They're not under British command, they're under American command. Their ultimate commander is General Clark, the commander of American forces, because the Americans are convinced they need something to help them punch through, and they know the reputation of British Special Forces and the SAS in particular. So Farren goes to the American commander and says, right, I want to deploy my men to link up with Leigh, and we're going to hit the 14th Army headquarters, but I want to go with them. And the answer is, you cannot deploy. You are too badly injured, but more importantly, you are too valuable. We have lost so many SAS commanders throughout this war. We have very few men left with your kind of experience. You are banned from deploying. And Farren goes, fine, will you at least let me fly in on the aircraft with my men to see them off? And the Americans, being Americans, say, sure, yeah, no, I can't do the accent, but they say, yes, of course, Major Farren, you can see your men off. So Farren flies in on the DC-3s with his number 3 Squadron SAS, and he is the first man out the door. And when Farron jumps, right, he knows he will face a court-martial. He knows this is the end of his military career, but he also knows that how would he stand in the repute of his fellow soldiers if, on this most momentous mission of the whole of the SAS's wartime history, you could argue, because they've never hit a target like this before. This is unprecedented. How would he stand in the view of his fellow soldiers if he doesn't deploy? So he's the first to jump, and before jumping, he says to the aircrew, the American aircrew, when you get back to Florence, you tell them I was there dispatching my men and I fell out the door. So the aircrew go back to headquarters. They tell Florence headquarters Major Farron fell out of the aircraft. He's reported killed in action. Okay? He links up with Lease. Lease briefs him on the target. All Farron's Christmases have come at once. And all Lease's Christmases have come at once, because he's got Farron on the ground with 40 seasoned SAS fighters. They can do this now. The trouble is, Farron wants, I mean, again, an amazing commander with a real common touch, but also an instinctive understanding of the Italian mentality. Farron understands the Italian partisans can be great fighters, but it's all about theatre with them. And he knows he needs to make them feel part of something. So he wants uniforms parachuted in. He's worked out that the Scottish Transvaal Regiment have berets with hackles, the feathers, which are the same colours as the Italian flag, right? So he wants one of his contacts to get all the Scottish Transvaal berets and hackles he can parachuted in, so the Italians can wear them, thinking they're actually wearing the Italian flag on their berets. He wants to get Ci Osella Vincera, which is a rough Italian translation of Who Dares Wins, embroidered on all their uniforms. He wants them to feel pretty much like they're part of the SAS, okay? But to do that, he's got to break cover, because he has to radio headquarters to ask for all these things. So Farron radios Florence. And you can imagine the proverbial hits the fan, because in Florence headquarters they're like, but you're dead. He says, yeah, well actually when I fell out of the aircraft I had a parachute on. And I had my weapons with me and my rucksack and all my equipment and supplies. But I'm here now and you can't get me back, so will you send in all these things I've asked for? There is consternation at Florence. High Command are apoplectic. You know, they're like, we're going to court-martial him when he gets back. But in the meantime, there's a battle flight, and there is a headquarters here that we need to hit. So yes, they agreed to drop in he's after. And Farron wants everything up to jeeps, parachuted in, SAS jeeps, so they've got mobility and firepower, and everything up to 75mm pack howitzers, which are these big 75mm guns which can break down and actually carry in their component parts, impacts over the hills to fire at your targets. So he gets all of that organised. He's not obviously in great favour, but he's on the ground and he's commanding this very important mission. And then, in perhaps the greatest single stroke of genius of the whole operation, Farron thinks there's a problem here. The problem is this: we go and sorry, bear in mind, this isn't what they are about to set out to do is not nice. They're not going in. They're not. He's ordered his men that you will take no prisoners. You're going in to murder every single German officer you can find. No one gets out alive. Okay? So this is not going to be pleasant. This is war at its most brutal. All right? And he thinks to himself, if we pull this off, and the odds are we won't, but if we do, the reprisals by the Germans will be so severe that every single Italian village in the area will get massacred. And if we do that, the Italian resistance will probably turn against us. So, in his greatest mark of genius, he radios headquarters and says, find for me a bagpiper. I need you to find me a bagpiper, and I need him parachuted in the next 72 hours. I need a bagpiper because I want him piping my men into battle. Because if you've got a piper playing Highland Laddie, the then regimental tune of all Scottish Highland regiments, it will stamp an indelible British signature on the mission, and no one can then claim that it was anything other than an Allied operation. And so there's this chap called David the Mad Piper Kirkpatrick. Okay? He's 18 years old. He's already earned that including kilt, right? And so there's all these Italian partisans and Russians and all the rest of it waiting on the drop zone, and they see what they think is a woman being parachuted in. And they think, what? Why are these crazy Brits sending in? I mean, I tell you how it kind of, it becomes so bizarrely otherworldly that because the SAS were at that stage wearing the red beret. Ask me a question at the end if you want to know why. But anyway, they're wearing a red beret with the wings, and they put the word out that they're not actually the SAS. They're actually members of the British Labour Party, there to liaise with the communists as their cover, so the Germans don't know what's going on. Anyway, this supposed woman lands on the drop zone, and Farron realises that he's got a bit of a public relations challenge on his hands. So there and then, as the flares glow in the darkness and the plane, the noise of the engine dies away, he gets Kirkpatrick to pipe Highland Laddie on the drop zone. And the Italians suddenly realise what this is all about. Because one, it's the most stirring battle music you could ever hear. But two, they realise that this is a British operation, and it will be shown to be a British operation by that man's presence there. Okay? So they're ready to go. And the evening before they set off, and they're taking 100 raiders, 20 SAS, 30 Russians, the rest are Italians, Spanish Civil War veterans, French Forest Legionnaires, and other assorted nationalities, okay? Including the German deserter Hans, who's going to shout German orders at the vanguard to try and confuse the German enemy when they attack. And the rest of the several hundred strong partisans with some of the SAS will remain in the Secchio Valley, because obviously the raiders need somewhere to retreat to when they've carried out the attack, because the Germans are going to come back like a whirlwind, and they need somewhere to defend and try to last out the counterattack. Okay, so they're going in with 100 men against 1,000. And the night of before they set off for the mission, Farron says to David Mad Piper Kirkpatrick, play, and he plays for the officers in Secchio village, and he plays all the piping tunes that they would normally play of a Friday evening at his own regiment. And that evening, as they're preparing to set off on the 72-hour march through enemy territory to get to the target, Mike Lee starts to feel feverish. He's had malaria in Yugoslavia, and he realises he's going down with malaria. By the next morning, he's very, very, very sick. And his radio operator, who's been with him a long time, a chap called Bert Farrimond, who is a Dour Lancashire miner of old, but now SOE radio operator. So not a man prone to over-emotion. As Leese is preparing to set out with the band of raiders, Farrimond says, "Sir, please don't go." And Leese says, "Bert, come on, this isn't right." And he says, "I've got a really bad feeling about this, sir. I really don't want you to go." He says, "Bert, just leave it out. This is not like you at all." And Leese sets off with Farron and the band of raiders on the trek into the target. They're 24 hours into that trek, and Farrimond's back at HQ manning the radio, and there's a message comes in, and the message says, "You have to stand the mission down. It's cancelled." And it's from Florence headquarters. And Bert Farrimond radios back saying, "Sorry, can't do it, they've gone." Florence headquarters gets more and more enraged. And Bert Farrimond keeps sending the same message about, "They've gone, what can I do? It's going to happen, the raid is going down." Florence headquarters realise there's a British liaison officer in the neighbouring valley, a major, and they send him the message. He gets on his bike, he cycles all the way through his valley after Farron and Leese and the raiders. He gets to a stage where he finds a young Italian boy that he can use as a runner. He gives him the message, and the runner catches Farron up and Leese up as they're having their final parade before crossing the lines into enemy territory. Farron's there surveying his motley band of raiders. He's worked them up into a fever pitch of self-belief. That in itself is a miracle. Think about it. A band of, at least half a dozen nationalities, speaking half a dozen languages from all over Europe, has suddenly got enough belief that they can go in and take out the German 14th Army headquarters. It's an extraordinary thing to have done. And Farron's there parading his men before they go in. And the runner turns up and hands him this piece of paper and he reads the message, mission cancelled. What does he do? What would you do? He decides that he's going to face a double court-martial. And he decides that Nelson-like, in the great long-standing tradition of British commanders, he never got the message in the first place. He will turn a blind eye. So Farron pockets the message. He looks at Leese. Now, Farron's a major, Leese is a captain. Farron's in charge of the whole gig in theory. And he looks at Leese, and Leese is very, very ill. And he thinks, I can't even ask this man to contribute to this decision because he is not in a capable state of doing so. So he takes the decision 100% on his own soldiers, and he orders his men to begin the march. 48 hours later, which in itself is an extraordinary achievement, they've got through 48 hours of marching through enemy territory, and they arrive at the Casa del Lupo, House of the Wolf, which is a farmhouse in the last of the foothills overlooking the plain of the River Po, upon which sit the two villas, the targets. Okay? They lie up there during hours of daylight. At 12 o'clock midnight they set off, and before setting off, Farron has his last supper, and he reminds his men, you're going in there to kill everybody. No one gets out alive, we are taking no prisoners. And he says, if you cannot kill everyone, you are to set fire to the two villas, and you're to burn them alive. Okay? No one gets out alive. This is murder most savage and cruel. And it's a really, it's a hard enough thing to have got this international band, this fever pitch where they believe they can do it, but then to charge them with such a murderous mission is an extraordinary thing to be able to do. Farron now starts navigating by what they call bearing and pacing. What you do is you walk on a northern bearing, you count your paces, you know how wide each pace is, and via that alone you can work out exactly where you are. They're navigating at night, silently, 100 men, and they're aiming for what they call the Half Moon Wood, a crescent-shaped wood adjacent to the two villas. They get to the Half Moon Wood without being discovered. They've made their way through all the German defences surrounding the villas. They can see them, they're very close. And Farron says, right, I split the force into three. The Russians will be the blocking group to make sure that none of the German reinforcements can get to the villas. You're to stop anybody getting through to help. And then he says, Leese, remember Leese, who is very, 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 very ill now, with Riccomini, a legendary SAS fighter, you will lead the attack on the Villa Rossi being the accommodation for the generals, okay? And he says to Lieutenant Harvey, a Rhodesian SAS soldier of 19 years old. I'll repeat that. He's 19 years old. You will command, because he's the most senior officer, the assault on the Villa Calvi, which is the German 14th Army's communication mapping headquarters. Okay? And so those two forces set off and they position themselves on the lawns of the two villas or castles, and still they've not been discovered. And the mission's supposed to be triggered by Lieutenant Harvey's group firing a bazooka to bust open the front door to the Villa Calvi so they can hit the target. And so they fire the first bazooka and it's a dud, and they fire the second and it's a dud, and the third is a dud as well, because it's an American bazooka and the ammunition is really not very reliable. And now Harvey can hear a German patrol scrunching on the gravel on its way up to the villa. So he goes to the entranceway with a Bren gun, and he realises this German patrol is suspicious. And so the mission's triggered by him opening fire and killing everyone on that patrol. At which stage, both units assault the villas by basically using grenades to blow the doors open and actually shooting their way in through the windows. And all hell lets loose. And in the Villa Rossi, Leese leads the assault. Leese is racked by malaria, leads the assault, and it has to try to get up the spiral staircase which leads to the accommodation quarter. They've taken us to the first floor, needs to get up the spiral staircase that leads to the accommodation where the German generals are based. And as he's storming that staircase, Leese is shot 5 times. You remember I said he formed an Italian special forces? His commander of that is with him, a guy called Glocca Manducci. He's also shot and he falls on top of Leese, and they're both wounded and left on the staircase. Riccomini and Gus Scott, 2 of the British SAS, try to storm the staircase to rescue Lise and Mon. They're shot and killed. It's carnage. And the then most senior commander left on that assault force realises that they will not take the upper floor, and so they set the ground floor aflame, whilst keeping the German forces on the top floor pinned upstairs. And they're just withdrawing from the Villa Rossi, when they notice a figure crawling towards the door, and it's Mike Leese. Mike Leese, shot 5 times, has crawled down the staircase, and he's got to the doorway. And they stop and they say, you know, sir, we've got to save you. He says, no, leave me, I'm done for, you've got to leave me, I'm done for. You know, leave me to the Germans. And they refuse. And they go out into the local orchard and they find a ladder, which has been used in the orchard, obviously, to pick apples. They come back with the ladder, they put Lise on the ladder, they strap him onto the ladder as a makeshift stretcher, and they carry him away from the villa, even as it's consumed by flames. And at the Villa Calvi, likewise, they've destroyed the German 14th Army headquarters completely, and it's left a burning pyre. And the main force reunites with Farron, and they start their epic escape and evasion. You've got to bear in mind, 72-hour infill, it's a similar distance they've got to try to get out again. All right? And now the whole of the German 1,000-strong garrison is alerted, and their blood is up, as you can imagine. Lise, meanwhile, on the ladder, is carried 3 kilometres to the nearest local farmhouse, where they know there's someone who's sympathetic to the Italian resistance. And they build a barrier of hay bales. They put Lise and his Italian Special Forces commander in the middle of the hay bales, and they say someone will come for you, and they leave them there. And the people who saved them then join the trek to try and get out again. So how do they get out? How am I doing for time? Am I all right? 5 minutes? Okay. So Farron leads his men out, and the way they manage to get out is they use benzodrine, speed. They're taking speed like it's Smarties. They literally use benzodrine and amphetamine to keep themselves awake for 24 hours and on the move without arrest. And that's how Farron managed to get all his men who survived back to the Secchio Valley without being caught by the Germans. That in itself is the most extraordinary feat imaginable. Okay? Meanwhile, Mike Leese is left in that house. And an Italian doctor comes to see him, Julie, with one of the resistance leaders, and says, look, if we don't get you out within 10 days, you'll lose the use of your legs, and you probably will not survive. He's got 10 days. And the whole of the Po Valley is crawling with Germans. It's crawling with German patrols, looking for the raiders. It's crawling with ambulances, carrying the wounded away from the villages. And let's be frank about it, it's crawling with hearses, taking away the dead. Okay? And the local resistance leader has an idea. He says, and he's kind of laughing, he says, I've got the most outrageous plan imaginable, but it just might work. He says, be ready tomorrow morning, we'll come for you. And the next morning, a German ambulance pulls up outside the barn, okay? And out of it gets a man dressed in a German uniform. When he comes in, at least thinks, who's got his pistol, thinks this is his final battle, and it's the Italian resistance leader. And what they've done is they've hijacked the German ambulance, okay? They've dressed themselves in German uniform. They then dress Lise in German uniform and bandage him as if he's a German soldier injured in the fighting. And in that way, they bluff their way through all the checkpoints which have been set up to capture them for about 15 kilometres to the nearest partisan territory, whereupon they get Mike Lise to this tiny little airstrip on top of a mountain, to which, from Florence headquarters, a former Italian Air Force ace, who's been highly decorated by the Germans for shooting down Allied aircraft, who's now been recruited by the SOE to fly missions for the SOE, flies in a tiny little Storch spotter plane, lands on this impossible matchbox-sized airstrip, loads the wounded Mike Lise aboard, and flies him back to Rome and saves his life and his mobility. Meanwhile, Farron, of course, is fighting for his life in the Secchio Valley. And largely actually because of the Russians and a lot of vodka, they managed to drive the Germans out of the valley, and the valley's not taken. And then Farron receives the order from the Americans, because the German 14th Army, how can I indicate how successful the raid was? Well, For 15 days, there were no communications. I've got, you can look at the records. For 15 days, there's not a single communication from the German 14th Army headquarters. It was moved completely, and it was off air for all that time. And in that period, the American orders are to Farron, you will go out in your jeeps and cause as much chaos and havoc behind the lines because we're coming through. Farron does that, links up with the American generals as they break through, and gets in his jeeps, and he's starting to drive back to Florence headquarters, mission accomplished, and he's thinking, no, I'm for the high jump, double court-martial. And meets one of the American generals en route, and the American general says, you're Roy Farron. He says, yeah. And he says, I've got something for you. And the Americans have decided to grant Major Roy Farron of the SAS the Legion of Honor, one of the highest American medals for courage you can possibly get as a foreigner. And so when he turns back in Florence, he's been highly decorated by the Americans. And as he says himself, how could they then court-martial me when the Americans had made me a hero? So although the High Command are enraged, the British High Command, there's nothing they can do to Roy Farron. But of course, there's everything they can do to Mike Lease, because Mike Lease hasn't been decorated by the Americans. Mike Lease is in hospital for many months, extremely badly wounded, never really recovered from his injuries, and they destroy him. They destroy him in terms of his reputation. Roy Farron writes him up for a military cross. He should have got much more than a military cross. It gets all the way through the SOE, it gets all the way mostly through military high command, and it reaches a certain stage, a political stage, where it's refused. And not only is it refused, but the kind of thing that I discovered in the archives, shocking, really shocking. Things were done which weren't necessary. They wrote to Mike Lease's parent regiment, the Dorset Yeomanry, in which Leases had served with distinction for generations, winning lots of high valour medals, saying not only should he not be given the military cross, but he is irresponsible, unreliable, he's a liar and a fantasist, and they do everything they can to kill his reputation. Shocking. And when I found these documents in the archives, I've never come across anything like it in all my time writing military history. You can ask me afterwards why I think that happened, and I've been able to take a lot of this documentation to the Lease family and show them what was done to their father, their uncle, and they were equally shocked and disturbed. But it doesn't take away from the achievement of the mission. Just days after the 14th Army headquarters were taken out and the Americans and British forces break through, Italy is liberated and the Allies march into Germany. And as a very untypical SAS operation, special forces hit and run missions, targets of opportunity. This is not that at all. As a very untypical SAS mission, it was pulled off with incredible skill and achievement and bravery. That's the story of SAS Tannenjoch.
Thank you so much, Damien. I'm sure that you're just as fascinated as I am. Any questions?
Fascinating, as you said. Two questions, if I may. Firstly, could it not perhaps be done as a bomber exercise?
Good question.
And secondly, what's happened? Do we know what happened to the Soviet survivors?
Great question. So, first question: could it have been done as a bomber raid? The reason why they tried to cancel the mission is for that very reason. They wanted to consider a bomber raid. The problem with a bomber raid was you've got to remember it's surrounded by Italian villages. You would have killed thousands of Italians, and what Lease and Farron and all the other British liaison officers know is that if you want to keep the resistance on side, how can you keep the resistance on side if a load of Allied bombers have come over and killed thousands of Italian villages? It's just not going to happen. That's why he took the decision he did. Second question, remind me?
Soviet prisoners.
So, the Russians who fought with the Allies, well, it's a shameful episode of British history, military history. At the end of the war, Stalin ordered all Soviet Russian nationals who had fought in the Allied cause to be repatriated to Russia. Those that were ended up in the gulags and were killed. Because Stalin's argument was they fought with the forces of Western capitalism. In this situation, Farron has that order. You are to disarm. Imagine it. He's told to disarm those 100-strong Russian fighters and put them on a train back to the Soviet Union. So what they do is they put them on the train through one door, they unlock the other door, and they let them all leave by the other side. And most of those Russians ended up marrying very beautiful Italian women and living a very happy life in Italy, and thank God they did. So yeah.
Next question's just over here.
Yeah, thank you very, very much indeed. I used to work in Ukraine with the successor agency to the KGB, and I would, just for the benefit of the audience, strongly recommend Mr. Lewis's book Operation Manhunt, because by heaven I can assure you there is an awful lot of very, very serious stuff still relevant today in that book. One among several items, I actually jumped back in my chair when I read it.
Really?
Indeed, yes. My question is, given that, how on earth did they manage to achieve such operational security and secrecy on their march in and out? Because you say this was this was key to the offensive,
yeah.
So it wasn't quite the depths of winter. The Italian days were getting longer.
Absolutely, yeah.
Really, the tactics must have been, fieldcraft must have been something.
Yeah, I mean, they moved at night and lay out during the days. It's the simple answer, but you're absolutely right. To get in there, just the infiltration itself was extraordinary. I suppose they had the benefit of the fact that, you know, all those Italian resistance fighters knew the lie of the land at the back of their hand. That was a huge help. It's not as if you were a bunch of SAS going in without local guides, and in fact the local guides were at the forefront of the column as it marched. But no, I mean, there were moments where they were very close to getting discovered. In fact, there were probably moments reading between the lines where some of the German garrisons probably knew there was an enemy unit on the move, but you've got to bear in mind, by that time of the war, did they really want to die when they knew possibly the fate of the Reich was doomed? So yeah, but it was an extraordinary achievement, absolutely.
Next question.
Was the Dye's reputation ever recovered? Mike Lee's reputation ever recovered, either through your research or earlier?
So, was Mike Leese's reputation recovered? No, sadly not. So Mike Leese suffered with his injuries for the rest of the war because he, what should have happened, he had very bad nerve damage, and nerves don't, if you don't have your nerve damage treated very quickly, it will never recover. So when he was flown to the hospital in Rome, because he was in disgrace, as far as the High Command were concerned, his damaged nerves were not treated for 3 months. He was back in the UK, and it was through family connections that they actually were family friends of Lord Allenbroke, who was head of the army at the time, and very close to Churchill. It was only through that connection that he was then removed from the general hospital he was in, put on in a specialist nerve hospital, and ward, and actually got treatment for his damage, by which time it was too late. So he suffered for the rest of his life with pain. In fact, he was in so much pain that his daughter has described to me how sometimes she'd walk into his study and see him with a gun to his head saying, "I'm going to kill myself, it hurts too much." And he didn't take his own life because actually he was a Catholic and he thought it was a sin against, so that's why he never killed himself. But I guess the one saving grace is they didn't know most of this, because the files, I don't know how much you know about it, but under the secrecy laws, files can be closed for 25, 50, 75 or 100 years or 150 years. And the files on how awfully Mike Leese was treated were not opened during Mike Leese's lifetime. So when I went to his family, his nephew, who's this most extraordinary... Mike Leese had 2 daughters, he didn't have a son, so his nephew, James Leese, was his honorary son. And when I went to meet him in Dorset, this man opened the door of this lovely Dorset farmhouse, and it was like, "You are Mike Leese." He's exactly the spitting image of him. He talks like him, and he says, everybody says that, big, huge guy. And so I was able to show him and Mike Leese's daughter the documentation which chronicled how he had been destroyed. And you know, they were shocked, but at least he didn't know he knew that he should have been decorated. And he was always asked by, you know, Farron, Leese, Maine, Sterling, they were all mates after the war. And when they would have reunions, everyone would kind of like say, why did you never get a medal? Because it was like no one could understand it. Well, the files reveal why. You can ask me why, I can tell you why I think why, if anyone's interested. It's an interesting story. You interested? Hands up, show of hands. Okay, right, so why was Mike Leese introduced at the end of the war? There are two possibilities. The first possibility is, you will remember in Yugoslavia there were the Chetniks, the right-wing partisans, and Tito's communist partisans, yeah? Leese was embedded with the Chetniks, okay? Towards the end of the war, Churchill made the decision to back Tito's partisans and not the Chetniks, so maybe he was on the wrong side of that debate. It's a possibility. I think far more likely is this. Come late autumn 44, you know, soldiers, and this includes the SOE, do what their political taskmasters make them do. That's the truth, isn't it? That's where orders ultimately come from. And there was a directive from on high, it came from the Foreign Office, let's be frank about it, that the Italian partisans were a menace. Why were they, and this is politically, not militarily. Militarily, they were essential. They were a menace because they were communist, most of them, right? But look, let's be frank about it. You tell me, what do the Italians like? They like olives and wine and dancing and having fun. That's the Italian mentality, and it's lovely, yeah? And so at the end of the war, what did the Italian communists do? They carried on drinking wine, having fun and dancing, and they pretty much said, well, we'll forget about our politics, and everybody, you know, there was no civil war in Italy, there was no communist takeover, it went back to being a democratic state, but the Foreign Office put a directive through to the army and the SOE in around about November 44 saying you will stop arming and supporting the Italian partisans. So when Leese radioed Florence headquarters and said, I've got the ideal target to help enable a breakthrough of the Gothic line, the message he got back was, Michael, don't make the fur fly. Because they were under orders from their political taskmasters. But, you know, was anyone going to tell Leese not to do this? Or was anyone going to tell Farron not to do this? Wasn't going to happen, was it? So I think he fell victim to vindictive politicians who basically thought you know, the most amazing mission you could argue in the whole of the Italian campaign in terms of regular forces was carried out largely by a bunch of Italian communist partisans. How did that sit with, you know, the new Cold War at the time? Not very well. Leese was the fall guy, and that's what I think happened.
We have time for 2 more questions.
What sort of damage was done to the German High Command? I mean, were there any famous generals killed in the attack?
The Chief of Staff, Colonel Lemston, died in the Villa Calvi, and General Hook, who was in the Villa Rossi, was incapacitated for long enough to have a significant effect. So the key thing was that 14th Army Headquarters was off air for 15 days. And during that 15 days, we achieved our breakthrough. So it did exactly what it was designed to do on the tin.
How many German soldiers killed then?
60.
60?
Yeah.
Oh.
So, I mean, it was a very, 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 you have to bear in mind, it's brutal, but look, this is war. And tens of thousands of Allied lives were saved. So when they set fire to the ground, the ground floors, they had their brain guns set up outside, and when people tried to come out the windows, they obviously killed them all. So it's very few got out alive. But it sounds murderous and brutal, but this was war. And, in the process of doing so, how many lives were saved? And that's not just Allied lives, that's also German lives as well, let's be frank about it. Yeah? So it did what it was designed to do, against orders, but it achieved, the aim at the time.